Hello, my name is George Falconer. Welcome to Peniel. So far, the edict has gone out in the book of Esther that the Jews are to be destroyed. However, the plot has been exposed by Esther, and now the king is very angry. He's had Haman hung, but the law still was in force and couldn't be revoked. So therefore, another law had to come into force in order to do something about it. Esther had told the king that she was a Jew and told him how Mordecai was related to her, being her cousin who brought her up. The king has given the same signet ring, his authority that he'd given to the enemies. He's given it to Mordecai so that he carries authority, and he's to write out this new law, and the Jews were allowed to assemble to defend themselves. And that is the situation we have here. Chapter 9. On the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, the edict commanded by the king was to be carried out. On this day the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, but now the tables were turned and the Jews got the upper hand over those who hated them. The Jews assembled in their cities in all the provinces of King Xerxes to attack these seeking their destruction. Tables turned. This was the very day the Jews were to be destroyed. Instead, this turned out to be the day that they were saved. No one could stand against them because the people of all the other nationalities were afraid of them. And all the nobles of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and the king's administrators helped the Jews because fear of Mordecai had seized them. Mordecai was prominent in the palace, and his reputation spread throughout the provinces, and he became more and more powerful. This is the man that was meant to be hung on those great big gallows and put to death. Instead, he has been exalted, and he became more and more powerful in the palace. God orders events. I've said that this book doesn't mention God directly, but God is seen in providence in this book. God orders the events. Far from being put to death, Mordecai is exalted, by the king, but in my view, behind the scenes, exalted by God, put into a position where he's able to do something to save his people. He and Esther are working together on this. She has exposed the plot, and now he's a strategist, putting things into place so that his people can be defended. And this is wise. You need wise people to carry out actions for God. People who've got experience, people who've got training, people who've got wisdom. The Jews struck down all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying them, and they did what they pleased to those who hated them. In the citadel of Susa, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. They also killed Paradatha, Dalphon, Aspha, Porada, Adalah, Ariditha, Paramatha, Arista, Aridai, Vaizala, the 10 sons of Haman, son of Hammedatha, the king of the Jews, but they did not lay their hands on the plunder. So they gained nothing from it except their lives. They didn't become richer because of it. They only saved their lives. They weren't motivated by stealing from their enemies. They were motivated by survival. The number of those slain in the citadel of Susa was reported to the king that same day. The king said to Queen Esther, "The Jews have killed 500 men and the 10 sons of Haman in the citadel of Susa. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now what is your petition? It will be given to you. What is your request? It will also be granted. If it pleases the king, Esther answered, give the Jews in Susa permission to carry out this day's edict tomorrow also, and let Haman's 10 sons be hanged on the gallows. Now, it seems to me, if this is recorded properly, that these would be dead bodies. And this would be a public exhibition to spell out to people, see what God has done for us. The father of these men plotted against us, and now we see all of them have been put to death because they plotted against us. In so doing, they were really plotting against God, the real God. This has got nothing to do with just personal hatred, although that certainly is much of it. But if the way it's recorded here means that they were put to death and then hanged, they would have been bodies hanging on gibbets, already dead. I might be wrong about that. Of course, it might have been that they were just hanged in the usual fashion. They were alive when they brought there, hanged there, but it seems to me they were already hanged. And people would see them as they hung there. And this would be reported throughout the kingdom. And I'm sure they wanted the news to go out all over the kingdom to spread the reputation that God's people had triumphed. So the king commanded that this be done. An edict was issued in Susa, and they hanged the 10 sons of Haman. The Jews in Susa came together on the 14th day of the month of Adar, and they put to death in Susa 300 men, but they did not lay their hands on the plunder. Once again, they didn't profit from it. They didn't become richer in the world's sense. But I'm sure they became richer in the spiritual sense, that God was blessing them by saving their lives. And I wonder how many people, even amongst the Jews, re-evaluated themselves and thought, I need to be worshipping God properly. And how many other people in the other nations turned to the one and only true God and worshipped him because of what they saw God was doing for his people. Meanwhile, the remainder of the Jews who were in the king's provinces also assembled to protect themselves and get relief from their enemies. They killed 75,000 of them, but did not lay their hands on the plunder. This happened on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th they rested and made it a day of feasting and joy. Although it's not called a banquet, again, food is involved, celebrating is involved. This book is full of feasting and celebrating as well as mourning. We need to celebrate what God has done, and that's what they were doing. The Jews in Susa, however, had assembled on the 13th and 14th, and then on the 15th they rested and made it a day of feasting and joy. That is why rural Jews, those living in villages, observe the 14th of the month of Adar as a day of joy and feasting, a day for giving presents to each other. Mordecai recorded these events, and he sent letters to all the Jews throughout the provinces of King Xerxes, near and far, to have them celebrate annually the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar, as the time when the Jews got relief from their enemies, and as the month when their sorrow was turned into joy. Sorrow was turned into joy. That reminds me of how sorrow was turned into joy. When Christ died upon the cross, there was much sorrow, but tremendous joy when he rose from the dead. And remember, he was doing that to save us. And what's happening here is being done to save the Jews. It is a parallel. I also think that what Esther did was a sort of parallel to Christ in a way, because she risked her own life when she went to the king. So likewise, Christ laid down his life for us. But he saved her life, and likewise he rose from the dead, and we are saved because of the fact that he has paid the penalty for our sin. He wrote to them to observe the days as days of feasting and joy, and giving presents of food to one another and gifts to the poor. The poor were to be looked after. In our own day, the poor also have to be looked after. We're told the poor will always be with us. Some people just are poor. But that doesn't mean to say they've to be despised. They're still made in the image of God, even the poor. And so, we have to look after the poor in whatever way we can. So the Jews agreed to continue the celebration they had begun, doing what Mordecai had written to them. For Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agite, the enemy of the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to destroy them, and had cast the pur. Notice how things keep being repeated in this book, about how Haman had plotted against the Jews and what his plan was. Sometimes we forget things and need to be reminded, so this book keeps on reminding us about the plot against the Jews. For the ruin, and that is the lot. It cast a lot for this, for the ruin and destruction. But when the plot came to the king's attention, he issued written orders that the evil scheme Haman had devised against the Jews should come back on his own head. Again, we're being reminded, this is the second time, the plot would come back on their own heads. If you're plotting wickedness, it will fall back on you, because God will see to it. God organises circumstances. We might think we do it, but God merely allows it. God is orchestrating everything that goes on, even the bad things. Haman had devised against the Jews should come back on his own head, and that his sons should be hanged on the gallows. Therefore these days were called Purim, for the word pure, because of everything written in this letter, and because of what they had seen and what had happened to them. The Jews took it upon themselves to establish the custom that they and their descendants and all who join them should without fail observe these 2 days every year in the way prescribed and at the time appointed. These days should be remembered and observed in every generation by every family and in every province and in every city. And these days of Purim should never cease to be celebrated by the Jews, nor should the memory of them die out among their descendants. We are inclined to forget things. So Purim, this festival, would remind the Jews generation after generation, family after family, down through the centuries, about what God had done in the days of Esther, King Xerxes, about how he had turned the plot around and used it to the advantage of the Jews, saved the Jews from their enemies. And remember this, the Jews were in captivity. They were subject to the king, who wasn't necessarily, well, their friend as such, but they were in captivity. They weren't in their own land. This is a people who have suffered by being taken away from their own land and put into exile. So they're fighting for their lives in exile. God still was working with the Jews. We see that in Mordecai. He didn't request, re-establish us in our own land. He asked to have their lives spared. In fact, Esther had said they would rather be slaves than be destroyed. So the circumstances are not quite what they may have liked. They had to accept the fact that God had put them into exile, as he had said he would do, to punish them for their wickedness. Sometimes the people of God are wicked, and they were put into exile for their own wickedness, for turning their backs on God. But even when they're in exile, there are still those who don't turn their back on God. But those who don't turn their back on God still had to go into exile. The situation was not by any means perfect. And yet this exiled man became the most powerful man in the realm, in the kingdom, even although he was in exile. Try to hold these two things together. Not what he would have liked, because he's in exile, but at the same time elevated to be the most powerful man in the kingdom next to the king. And he has to hold these two things together. Responsibility to the king and to the kingdom, and at the same time his responsibility to God as someone in exile. And of course I think he's being used to broadcast God's truth to the whole kingdom. So Queen Esther, daughter of Abihail, along with Mordecai the Jew, wrote with full authority to confirm the second letter concerning Purim. And Mordecai sent letters to all the Jews in the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Xerxes, words of goodwill and assurance, to establish these days of Purim at their designated times, as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther had decreed for them, and as they had established for themselves and their descendants in regard to their times by fasting and lamenting. Esther's decree confirmed these regulations about Purim, and it was written down in the records. Now the fasting, what did they do in the run-up to Esther having to go before the king? They spent 3 days in fasting and prayer. And again, fasting and praying, for Purim would remind them of that. God answers prayer, and he certainly answers fervent prayer. Sometimes God might not necessarily answer prayer in the way that we would like or the way we imagine, but he answers prayer, and he does what is best. God is not a genie granting us 3 wishes. And when Esther entered to the king's presence, God had not told her in advance, it's going to be okay, he'll extend the scepter to you, your life will be spared. She went in there saying, if I perish, I perish. And she was trusting God. She was trusting God to save her life, but she was also trusting God even if she perished. And that reminds you of Daniel saying that, if I die, I die, but we're not going to bow the knee to the king. That's idolatry. And Mordecai and Esther are doing the same thing, not tolerating idolatry. And if I die, I die. Are we like that? Maybe it might not be dying, could be, of course, in many other areas of the world. You support God, you die. So let's not lose sight of that. I think in the West we tend to be very complacent, but throughout the world Christians are persecuted and put to death. And remember to pray for their families. Let's not forget, persecution goes on now on a scale that makes this look minuscule. Far more people are put to death now because of their faith than ever before. And they go to it with the conviction, if I die, I die. And I'll leave you with that sobering thought.